IsaGucchardi is the founding director and primary teacher of Sacred Stream. She has been a dedicated Buddhist practitioner for 40 years and has spent over 30 years studying spiritual, therapeutic, and meditative techniques from around the world.
Hi there, I'm Cameron Trimble, and I am the CEO of Convergence, and I am honored and delighted to be in conversation with IsaGucchardi, who has become a dear friend to me and a colleague, a fellow geek on all things spiritual and psychological and shamanistic. Is that even a word? Just a wonderful friend who we wonder about life together. So I'm grateful, Isa, for this time that we get to spend together. I wonder, could you tell all of us a little bit about your history, your background, and particularly about your work right now, the Foundation of Sacred Stream, and the powerful work that you all are doing that I hope more and more people connect to?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to participate here and so happy to be invited. And thank you for asking about my history. It's, it's a varied and complex history like most people's. I grew up in many different countries and was exposed to a lot of different spiritual traditions during that time. And I was also very much exposed to a lot of different natural environments. And one of the things that I noticed as a very, very young person was that things in nature seemed to be okay. That, it was peaceful, it was nurturing, it was beautiful. And being around people, it was more complicated. People were so unhappy, and people had so many problems. And one of the earliest questions I ever had was, how can we bring the peace of nature to the human experience? And that was a question that stayed with me, and is still with me now. And as I entered into my formal education, I set about to find a culture that I thought really reflected the peace of nature. And I got a degree in linguistic and cultural anthropology, and found a couple of cultures that I thought were close, but I hadn't quite found exactly what I thought. And I thought, well, maybe it's a religion, not a culture. So I got a degree in comparative religion, and I kind of settled on Buddhism and shamanism as two places that were reflecting the peace of nature. And also you find these two spiritual traditions in cultures that tend to also be closer to the wisdom of nature. And so I have a long history of practicing Buddhism and a long history of being engaged with shamanic practices and studying shamanism, and working together with those two spiritual traditions. And as I started to get my PhD in transpersonal psychology, I also decided to become a hypnotherapist. And as I sat down to do hypnotherapy, I realized that it wasn't adequate. As wonderful as it was, and as much as it took us beyond just the conscious mind's way of looking at things, there were aspects to people's experience that needed the healing of the shamanic practices that I knew, and needed the framework of understanding about the nature of suffering that Buddhism provided. So I began in the clinical setting developing a process that I have named depth hypnosis, DEPTH. A lot of people think it's death hypnosis, which, we could help explore the worlds beyond death with that, but it's depth hypnosis. And I began working with the healing practices drawn from shamanic work, such as soul retrieval, power retrieval, adapting it into the Western clinical framework, and also using the Four Noble Truths teaching on the nature of suffering from Buddhism as a lens through which to view the people who I was trying to help, to view their situation. And pretty soon I had a pretty amazing system that emerged from the clinical environment. And within the first year of practice, I couldn't see everybody who wanted to see me. I had a really long waiting list. And even though I was seeing 30 people a week, I couldn't get to them. So I started teaching. And as I started teaching, I realized there was more and more that needed to be taught in order for people to understand the deeper roots of shamanic practice, the deeper roots of applied shamanic practice, and the deeper experience of integrated energy medicine, which is at the heart of everything. And so I started teaching all these different classes and working with transpersonal psychologists and doing collaborations, and pretty soon realized that we needed a school because this was getting way bigger than depth hypnosis. It was also applied shamanism. It was also applied Buddhist psychology. It was also integrated energy medicine. It was also all of the insights that come out of understanding relational experience through transpersonal psychology, and of course, hypnotherapy, all working in an altered state of awareness. So I established the foundation of the Sacred Stream with Laura Chandler, who is now the executive director. We had the good fortune of being able to buy an old Lutheran church that was built in 1916 in Berkeley. And we've been teaching there for many years now, all of these different classes. And then we have also expanded into hosting in the space other teachers from any spiritual tradition that we feel does what we're doing, which is to try to perceive the common roots of artistic and spiritual knowledge and wisdom and bring them forward into the world to improve everyone's situation. And that's really what we do. We are a school for consciousness studies and seeking to preserve the wisdom of ancient traditions while respecting those traditions, but also bringing forward the essential aspects of them and applying them to the modern context, because the spiritual situation and the emotional and mental situation of modern humans is, of course, in some ways similar to people who have always lived on the earth. But given the level of destruction that we're dealing with in terms of the natural world, the disintegration of cultural structures, the loss of trust in traditional ways of knowing things on a mental or spiritual or emotional level, people are trying to navigate in a much more complicated experience than I think that I mean, of course, I haven't been here every moment of the last 50 billion years, but it looks quite different, I think, than people who are working with issues in a more traditional kind of experience, where you have a close relationship with the natural world, where you have a society that is not torn apart by trauma, where you have cultural traditions that are intact. And so we're working to bring forward the ancient wisdom of any tradition that can provide us with some insights about our situation. And depth hypnosis itself is primarily focused on healing trauma. And I think that most people are so traumatized on so many different levels that as they come for help within the work here at the Sacred Stream, they find that as their trauma is healed and helped through the processes of these different schools of thought, that they are then able to set out on a quest to know themselves more deeply on a spiritual level, and to actually even work with the trauma that they have been exposed to as a teacher, that brings them further into a deeper understanding, not only of the nature of healing, but of the nature of the self. So I think that's a summary of where I've been and where I am.
What I have, well, there are endless things that I appreciate about you, but what I've so appreciated about your approach to this work is that it's so integrated, that it's or holistic, maybe is a better word, or maybe both are good ones. That it takes a wider view than I experience many of our more traditional faith traditions, and tries to integrate the fullness of the cosmos, if you will, in a way that allows the blossoming of the human being and the human soul. So when we were thinking about the topic of this online summit, and then settled on it being, what is the future of spirituality? I think you were probably the first person I called when that topic was set, because I thought of all the people who could help us imagine a holistic approach to spirituality, one that helps us build a sustainable relationship with our planet, and a healing relationship and a safe relationship, or a whole relationship with each other. You're one of those visionary leaders for us. So I want to ask you this gigantic question. When I say, Isa, what is the future of spirituality? Or what do you see? What do you see? And because I'd love to know.
Oh, I definitely see something. I'll offer you what I see and see what you think about it. I think the future of spirituality is the empowerment of the individual. And I think that this is a very big shift from traditional ways of thinking about spiritual practice, because in many traditional forms of spirituality, you have the construct of the spiritual tradition that often seats itself between the person and spirit. And that construct also provides certain definitions and certain pathways that one must follow in order to encounter spirit. And on the one hand, I think that's very, very helpful, because it can provide a path for people who really don't know where to start. And so they, finding certain, certain things that are prescribed, such as, there's some things that are very common across many different spiritual traditions as entry points. One of those is service. And so as a person steps into thinking about, how can I offer myself? How can I be of service to the world of spirit? There are a lot of different definitions for that in a lot of different spiritual traditional contexts. But that move toward service, that desire to serve, opens us to the larger experience of the cosmos, to the larger experience of spirit itself. And I think that we need to allow that opening to be less defined by, certainly it needs some definition, it needs some structure, and to have any different tradition to offer its idea about that, how that opening into service might bring one into closer contact with the divine. As certainly it's a wonderful doorway, but to provide some guidance, but to not be too orthodox about it, to not say, this is the way that you have to do it, or this is the only way that you can do it, or this is, if you don't do it this way, something bad will happen. And everyone else who's not doing it this way is going to have bad things happen to them. That kind of thinking, I don't believe is part of the future. I think the future of spirituality lies in helping each person look within themselves to see what it is that draws them inward. And the truth is that for a lot of people, what draws them inward is their own pain, because they're trying to understand why am I in pain and what is separating me from wholeness. And that inquiry is a very important inquiry, because it can open doors that are individual for each person. And I think we need a spirituality that meets each person on their path, wherever they are, at whatever level of spiritual development they are at, as they begin to try to understand their pain and try to understand what's separating them from wholeness. And so we need a very flexible form of spirituality, one that embraces many different ways of knowing, one that respects many different ways of knowing, but one that does not demand a particular type of engagement in order to be able to connect with spirit. That has the flexibility and the trust within each individual that that sense of wholeness that they are seeking lies within them, and that the spiritual practice's job is to help the person find the path within them that leads to spirit in their own way, and to provide them with ordering context, with cohesive and enough structure that they can find their way through the places within them that have been damaged, and therefore make them think or feel in ways that lead them away from wholeness. And so to provide enough structure to help them address that problem, but not so much structure that it shuts down the inquiry into what is this path within me and how does it lead to the divine.
Do you think then that, well, I only have 20 questions after that, but that maybe our more institutional approaches to religious life, such as we might define that, have become a bit calcified, maybe set too much in cement, and that your instinct is, if we had a kind of a freeing of that, a loosening or a breaking open, that a new kind of authenticity maybe, or a new invitation to curiosity on that spiritual journey would be made possible. Is that what you're suggesting?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the truth is that all spiritual traditions started with, that spark, a spark toward the understanding of the divine, right? And that spark needs to be preserved in some ways. And so you have structures that are there trying to preserve it. And then you have, lineages that get established to try to hold that spark properly as it's passed from generation to generation. And I think there's something valid in that. But those structures can get calcified, as you say. And then only certain people can have access. And then other people who are outside the lineage can't have access. And only people within the lineage can define that spark, rather than having an experience where, oh, here's this divine inspiration of this any particular spiritual tradition. How do we help individuals develop so that they can touch the authenticity of that spark in their own way? And how can we trust them? And to be able to do that in a way that is faithful to the spark. And the way that you learn and you learn how to trust others, and how other people learn how to trust themselves, is they learn how to remove any obstacles that we may have that within us that are due to too strong attachments to things being a certain way, too many ways of avoiding certain things, and too many wrong knowings that are based in our desires or our dislikes. And that requires a lot of personal responsibility and a lot of personal engagement. And that's why I feel the spirituality of the future needs to have a way to help people answer these questions and perceive to perceive the effect of not being in alignment and trusting oneself because one is too attached or too avoidant to a particular idea. And we have to, in some ways, learn to let go internally so that we can meet spirit without too many filters and without too many demands that it be a particular way, but enough that we know and we can trust, and we can and trust in the presence of spirit at all, and trust in our capacity to perceive it. And that's another part of the spiritual development that needs to happen. People do not know, in general, I find, how to perceive spirit on their own terms. And there are two ways of meeting spirit. One is, here's the external image of spirit. Here's the external practice. Engage in this image and engage in this practice, and you'll find spirit. And many people do. But there's also, here's the nature of spirit. How can you find your way to it internally? How can you know this on your own terms? And here are the tools that we can provide you in order to meet this in your own way, and in a way that is faithful to the source or the spark of the divine impulse that resides at the heart of everything.
I was hearing in this and in your earlier statement that pain becomes, what these are my words, not yours, so make sure that I don't misrepresent, but becomes almost an invitation to adventure, like a threshold through which we can enter into that exploration.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you were just saying, and if we could just let go, and I was just thinking, how do you just let go? Like, how does that happen for people? How did that happen for you?
Well, through healing. For me, for sure, through healing. Because, one of the things that you see, especially like in the Eastern traditions, you see this pursuit of the enlightenment, or you see the pursuit of the divine. And, this idea that you have to let go of yourself, right? And then when you let go of your small self and you understand that there is no self, that you're going to be enlightened. That's impossible. No one can do that just with that instruction, because people have a lot of, especially modern people, have a lot of ways in which they have been separated from that core goodness within them. And they need to individually heal their relationship to that core goodness. In Buddhism, that's called Buddha nature. And in many other traditions, it might be called one's core power or one's higher self. There's a lot of ways of conceiving of this. But you have to individually heal within your relationship to this wholeness within you, and allow it to infuse the places within you that have been separated or harmed, often due to trauma and due to the unconsciousness of people who raise us or who interact with us. And so you have to weave yourself back together, so that when you let go of yourself, you have total trust in your connection internally, and then you can connect with the larger experience of the divine in a way that doesn't shatter you, or that doesn't create a spiritual emergency, so that where you can't hold your experience. And you find this happening quite a lot, where people have these experiences of the divine. They're chasing these kind of, experiences of the divine, and without having done that healing, and they wind up in a spiritual crisis, which is okay, because that's where we can start. It's not okay for the person going through it, but it's okay for, for the work that we do here at the Sacred Stream. That's okay. So that's the moment where we start that dislocation with the spiritual crisis. Having tried to become non-dual too quickly, we can go ahead and begin to pick up the pieces and figure out where we need to weave together the person's experience so that they can hold and integrate that larger experience of the divine. And so pain is definitely a teacher at every level that I've just spoken about.
I struggle to think of many, maybe even any religious institutions per se that I've worked with over 20 years of doing this work who understand that that's what we're actually up to. That we're actually up to the empowerment of the individual, and working at that level, at that depth. And it strikes me that so many of our systems are, in utter panic that there are more spiritual but not religious people, and that number just keeps growing and growing and growing. But it makes perfect sense in light of what you're saying, that the craving, that the calling, if you will, the invitation to the you're seeking, is from that deep internal spiritual, even psychological space, and that many of our places are not geared for that. I'm wondering about rituals and practices, and as you have done this work for a long time, and then as you're imagining it continuing, what are the practices that you honor, that you would hope would carry forward into the future of spirituality?
Well, I think that the most important thing, I don't know a particular type of ritual or a particular ceremony, I'd like to address it at a larger level than that, because one of the things that rituals do, and one of the things that ceremonies do in any tradition, is that they create in some ways a ladder or a structure between the world of spirit and the world of humans. And a quote unquote holistic ceremony is very much in tune with the world of the unseen, and trying to understand what the humans who are here for the ceremony need in order to be able to come into a sense of wholeness or a sense of meaning, or to feel that they have received something of value. And I'd like to tell you a story about this, because and that can happen at a lot of different levels. There's no prescribed way that needs to happen. But I want to tell you a story where I encountered the Catholic Mass really for the first time. And it was when I was actually working in Zen hospice at Laguna Honda Hospital here in San Francisco, which is the largest convalescent hospital for indigent people west of the Mississippi. So it's this huge place. And it had big 18-bed wards, and I was there working in the hospice, and as a volunteer, helping people understand their experience as they were dying. Well, that was my hope. I don't know how well I succeeded there. Was my intention. And one of the things that would happen every Tuesday afternoon was that the Catholic Mass would be performed in the cafeteria. So I always volunteered for that. I actually worked on Tuesdays so I could volunteer for that. And so I would bring a group of people from the hospice with me to the cafeteria, and the priest would set up a portable altar on one of the cafeteria tables, and the place would be reeking of meatloaf. And as a vegetarian, I held firm. We went through the meatloaf, and I felt it was part of my spiritual practice. And so the first time I did that, I had with me people from all over the world, Filipinos, American Indians, white people, African Americans, Asian Americans from other places throughout Asia. So there was a real melting pot of people who were Christians and for whom the Mass was very important. So we came, and I remember the first time when the priest began with the chalice and the host, and he began the ceremony about how this is Jesus's body, receive it. This is Jesus's blood, receive it. And just a parenthesis here, I have a very strong relationship with Jesus from having gone to missionary schools as a little girl in the Pacific. And, really, I didn't have much of the liturgy taught to me. I just had the stories told to me of his healing and his ministry. And for me, he was, this most marvelous person. And, so I have this strong connection with Jesus, but I didn't have the exposure to the structures of the church because I was too small and they weren't teaching that so much in the school, because I didn't go to Sunday school or anything that. It was just, I went to the school during the week. So, so I'm like, Jesus, oh man, great. And then it was like, and the priest was, here's the body of Christ, and everybody's going, and then the call and response started, and everyone says, here's the body of Christ, and they sort of went into this drone, and I'm like, this is the body of Christ, this is his blood. Oh my God, we're drinking this. This is amazing. We could do this. And I'm like crying, and I'm having this ecstatic experience, and everyone's going, and the body of Christ, I'm like, I was really kind of like, that was like a major learning for me. And, the thing is, most of the people there spoke other languages than English as their first language. And they were finding this meeting place in this ceremony that they had participated in their whole lives. And it was a ceremony that connected them with their understanding of the divine, that was acting as an anchor or a buoy for them as they were ending their lives. But I don't think anybody was actually thinking about Jesus. Like, I don't know if anyone really felt the power of Jesus coming through the ritual. And it didn't matter, because they were at the level where they were. That was what they needed. But for me, the infusion of the divine spark through that ceremony was truly overwhelming. And I'm not saying I'm better or worse or anything. I'm just saying it was different. And on one level, we can say, I don't think the priest was really in touch with what he was actually doing, invoking the body and blood of Christ, in terms of, what spiritual sustenance he was offering at that level. But certainly he was offering spiritual sustenance at the other level. And I think that I tell that story because I think that we can revivify all of the traditional ceremonies that may be in any given tradition that hark back to the essence of the spark that they were designed to hold and designed to bring in. But we must become more aware in order to truly touch that divine spark and allow it to nourish us on all the levels that it can. Again, it was nourishing those people at the level where they were, but they were getting ready to die. And for them to be able to have had the opportunity to touch it at the more subtle levels would have been marvelous. And I'm sure on some level, many of them, or some of them may have been able to do that. I wasn't aware of it. But I think that, as they were dying, the ones that I knew who took Mass every week when I was sitting at their bedside, I would say a Christian prayer for them. I would say it out loud, and I got myself a prayer book, and I'd ask them if they had a prayer that they wanted to say. And that the ceremony of their lives of saying that prayer and that ritual helped them die. And so I think that, we need to understand the way in which ceremony and ritual is actually connecting us with the spirit of the divine, and to not allow it to become rote or dead. And we can discover that life within it by, again, educating ourselves, and by learning to learn internally, and to follow that seeking of the connection with wholeness that so many people do engage in, especially when they're in a place of pain and or in crisis of some kind. So there's my thought about ceremony and ritual.
Good thoughts. I was struck in your telling of that story. There were two things going on in me that maybe are illustrative of what you were trying to teach. When you brought up the Eucharist and communion, I was in my mind thinking, and you were talking about the body and the blood, and I was thinking, oh, what a cannibalistic ritual that we've had as part of our tradition. And I've, the awkwardness of explaining this to people who don't have that in their history. And I get all of the beautiful theological pieces of it and see the beauty. And, as a pastor of congregations have held that ritual every week. And then in your storytelling, I watched your face absolutely light up. Like you went from Isa at this point in life to Isa, this 4-year-old little girl who was just wowed by this, this moment that you had. And I thought, or what you invited for me was this beginner's mind posture, this curiosity about these wonderful traditions that we're the inheritors of, but that we have, that maybe have become sort of stale in our holding. And that's part of the invitation as we're shaping this future wondering around spirituality. But
Thank you for that, Cameron. Thank you. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Tell me about and I'll make this maybe, I won't promise, but maybe the final question. But so what you're helping me see and wish for and wonder about is how do we move from so many of these religious gatherings that we have? Some traditions call them congregations, some collectives, we have all kinds of names for this, but these spaces where we gather and increasingly feel performative and increasingly are losing that kind of authentic spark that you're talking about. How do we be community together? How do we belong with one another in this kind of seeking that you're pointing to? Do you have any instincts around what these communities might look like and the promises they might make to each other?
Well, for me, the inquiry into spirit is so individual. And I think it really does need to begin there. And then have people that are seeking in their own individual way come together to understand a little bit better what they are seeking through the lens of other people, so that everyone has this sort of equal kind of potential for understanding spirit, so that it's not like one person. I mean, some people may know more about the nature of spirit than others, but that, so nobody's like, I have it and nobody else does. And that we understand that we're all developing spiritually, and that whatever kinds of problems that we may be having on a community level have a reflection on an internal level that needs to be addressed properly before the community level can be completely resolved. And you see this in my book, Coming to Peace, which is a book about conflict resolution between communities based on Buddhist and indigenous forms of conflict resolution, including Ubuntu from Southern Africa, Ho'oponopono from the Pacific, and from the Iroquois League from the eastern seaboard of North America. And in each of those traditions, it's understood that if the individual is out of balance, the collective will be out of balance. And so there's a lot of support. And I outline, I mean, I've adapted this idea and created a kind of container with certain values that people who are engaged with one another, especially in the resolution of conflict, agree to abide by. And those include taking personal responsibility for one's actions, meeting others with mutuality and respect, the willingness to engage in the process at all, willingness to establish a relationship with their own inner wholeness and wisdom that they are willing to return to if they find themselves not abiding by these qualities. And so then, you know, and the Coming to Peace process focuses on conflict, but this way, these values are important to offer to any kind of communal situation where people are seeking to try to abide by truth, by consensus, by remembering that everyone wants to be happy in the way that they do. And so you have communities that are based in this, and you have processes that are designed to help people have timeouts when they're not engaging with that. And in order to have that work, everyone needs to be engaged in their own the resolution of their own internal conflicts. And so there is another practice within Coming to Peace called Inner Coming to Peace, which helps people identify and work with the splits within them that keep them from being whole. And so, you know, then they have this whole internal process that they can work on in order to be able to be a more community-oriented citizen of the community. And so I think that provides that book and that process provides, I think, a pretty good template for how communities might interact with one another in an ongoing way going forward.
Well, having read that book multiple times, I agree with you. I think it's an incredibly helpful resource. So I hope that people do check that out. And it's not your only book, so read all the things. Is my advice to people. Okay, final question, promise. When you're thinking about this idea of the future of spirituality, what one word comes to mind that the rest of us, could kind of hold as a guidepost or as maybe a point of inspiration that you would leave with us? What one word holds it?
Peace.
Yeah. Especially on a day like today.
Yes.
Well said. Well said. Isa, I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for this conversation.
Likewise, Cameron, thank you so much for talking to me.
Always.